This week, we are still in Sowilo through the 27th, at which point we move into Tiwaz. It seems to me like our time in Sowilo has flown by. Like everything leading up to that, pretty much for this runic cycle, it's just been an odd blur of crawling by, and yet I don't know where it went, but Sowilo just seemed like it flew by. So this transition to me is a huge one. I don't know if it's just personal, but the transition from Sowilo-Tiwaz, from the second Aett to the third Aett, is always extremely felt. It resonates with me deeply. We've come through the first Aett, which is this experience of figuring out how we soul in form. And for the most part, the experience of the first Aett is pretty sweet. The biggest hurdle in the first Aett is realizing that we are part form, part soul, coming to terms with the yearning that that creates, this knowing that there is more of us that is deeply empowered and quite possibly limitless in beyond Earth space, and also understanding the power of agency that we have while we're in form. And we have this experience through the first Aett of sort of realizing our power here and what we can do with it in this really gentle, moving, sweet way. But by the time we close the first Aett, we are also experiencing that with other beings. And I would even say, in the context of the runes, as sort of guideposts to help us human well, it's specifically referring to how we have assistance from other humans, how we form relationship, what forms from those relationships, and how those connections advance our callings individually, but also create collective spaces that then take on their own life force and their own agency, and how we help those sustain and move forward. Then we move into the second Aett, which is a huge transition. That whole sort of lullaby sweetness is set aside, and it becomes bittersweet in many ways. We realize that no matter how empowered we feel internally, there's still internal strife that we're having to manage ongoing. There's also external strife. So we start weaving in between all these other beings, human and other than human, who also have agency, who also have callings, and they're trying to get their stuff done. We're dealing with the impact of the agency from them when they hold it well and when they don't hold it well, or when they intentionally mean to do us significant harmful impact. And we're also trying to mitigate how the impact of the way we move among affects everybody else. The second Aett for me is where that whole "and harm ye none" thing goes out the window. There's no such thing as not harming. And that's what we learn in the second Aett. Being in form is as much about causing harm as it is about causing support and stability and belonging. And we're learning how to mitigate all of that in the second Aett. And so it still has these really sweet moments, but we've learned that life isn't only sweet, and it's not going to stay one or the other. It's going to be this continuous moving back and forth between things that really sort of smack and things that are also really moving and tender. So when we get to Sowilo, we're brought back to that tenderness. We're brought back to the reminder that we are not here just for ourselves and our own calling, and even that our calling isn't ours. It's really for everybody else. The fulfillment of it is what is ours. In the transition from Sowilo-Tiwaz is an incredibly abrupt awakening that what we came to terms with in the first and second Aetts, quite possibly as our calling itself, and so many other things that become what I call our heart song along the way. Not just like the calling itself, but the relationships, the ways of moving among that we amass and learn to facilitate us doing that become challenged with Tiwaz. And that's, to me, is the real maybe heartbreak moment, the real initiatory, like catalyzing moment of the entire Elder Futh arc for me is experienced in Tiwaz. And that is the shift into the third Aett. I don't think it necessarily has to be a horrific trial. And it doesn't necessarily matter because the emphasis of Tiwaz is how we choose to go forward from that. And what that implies is this experience of, I know that I can't go forward the way that I've been moving along. And so I have to change that movement somehow. It's not that I don't get to move. It's not that I don't keep experiencing all the relationships that support and hold me in that, but I have to do it differently. I have to let go of the heart song. And the challenge in Tiwaz isn't that you won't be victorious, but you won't be victorious the way you planned to be. The way you set the dominoes up is not going to fall in the pretty pattern that you want them to. They will fall, and there will be a pattern revealed, and it will be beneficial, it will be creative, and help you to move on in a facilitated way. But dealing with the grief that it is not going to be the heart song that you've set yourself up to have is what has to be transmuted with Tiwaz. It's not that there's battle, as we know this rune represents. It's not that there isn't deep and hard transition and sacrifice. It's that we have to realize we still have to move on. We're not done. Just because we've had a tremendous sacrifice doesn't mean our calling stopped. It doesn't mean that our communities stopped needing us to do what we came here to do. And that's the challenge of Tiwaz. So we have Sowilo through the 27th. We move into Tiwaz until the 14th of March. This is the point that I encourage you to remember. Working with the runes in this calendric format isn't an indicator that because we're in Tiwaz, we're going to have this sacrificial grief moment. It doesn't portend that. It reminds us that this is part of life. It reminds us to sit with Tiwaz for this period of time and learn from it. Like, remember that we're in relationship with it and learn what it has to teach us in this cycle, this runic cycle of how we deal with those heart song moments being sacrificed and the grief and how we process it, how we must move on. That is what Tiwaz teaches us in this 2-week period. The rune that best facilitates this transition from the second Aett to the third Aett, but also sort of smooths the speed bump in moving from Sowilo to Tiwaz is Jera. And that's an incredibly optimistic rune for both of these. Jera, when working with Sowilo, is a reminder that our harvest isn't just ours, ever. On the most solitary level possible that we can think of ourselves, the way that we manage what comes into our lives, the bounty, the blessing, the harvest, it affects other people. Even if it doesn't mean we're directly sharing the harvest itself, the way that the harvest affects us allows us to move in community in a better way. And I feel like that only enhances the pay it forward aspects of Sowilo. And with Tiwaz, there's an incredibly positive edge around that as well. With Tiwaz, we're talking about a sacrificial experience from which we have to deal with the grief of letting go of one thing so that that's the success of what we were looking for, the victory can still come. I feel like Jera is reminding us of the resources that we have to be able to process the grief and to come into that next phase of our lives. Part of the undercurrent of Jera, when you read it in terms of, or in the process of the healing story, or what some people call the hero or heroine's journey, Jera is the point in that lore that we gain allies. It's the point in that trajectory that we gain tools and relationships that not only help us to not transmute our stuff by ourselves, but they hold us. They hold space for us to do the transformation stuff that is ours to do. So like they're not just present in this helpful, hey, what can I do kind of way, but they help us hold the space on a continuum. So I would say take some time with Tiwaz in particular after we move into it later this week to maybe offer blessings to the tools, to the resources and relationships that are your harvest, the things that come into your life that help you do things better. This would be a good week to do some reciprocal work with those relationships. How do you give gratitude to them? And not just, oh, gee, thank you. How do you gesture thank you to these relationships in the physical world? How do you make offerings to your ecosystem that represents the exchange of relationship that's happening at harvest? Some of our harvest relationships and tools this week include our direction element, season, and our helping spirit. The direction that we're working with this week is Austri or East. For me, that is the Atlantic Ocean. It's to my right side or this side when I'm calling in directions. So for me, East is all about water. It's about flow, being carried, being able to energetically assess my regulation and see where it is in regard with capital F flow and make the adjustments that I need to experience that. So there's a component of East and oneness for me, like helping me get there whenever life is just kind of trying to take me out of that. So it's specifically Atlantic Ocean for me, which represents home in that all of life emerged from the ocean. All water flows back to the ocean. And for me, it also represents the fields that grew the food that I ate, especially in my childhood and kind of sort of now, but considerably less. It speaks to ecosystem, home, and literal nurture. So whenever this direction comes up in casts, explore what home means, what feeds you, what protects you, what holds you, and at the most sacred and embodied levels. Like literally consider where your body feels best. Where does body choose to be placed when it has the opportunity to choose? And consider what makes space feel sacred and how to get more of that in your immediate living space. The element that we're working with this week is ether. Ether for me is in the top 5, like not in a hierarchical sort of way of working with the elements, but for me it is one of the cardinal ones. The elements are the active components of everything. They're how we get things done, and they facilitate our agency to actually have an impact. Without the elements, our agency wouldn't do anything. Ether for me is this state of everything and nothing, and it is eternal. Whether we stop existing, Earth stops existing, ether persists. It is everything and nothing all at one time. And I think it is also the presence of all of the elements in balance. And so it's this state of infinite interconnectedness, we could say interdependence and belonging, And that is the basis of all of life. It's an unseen form of sacred order. So, ether, when it comes up in the runecast for me, is about how we tap into that. How do we experience ourselves as infinite? How do we experience the ether of ourselves? What about us is everything and nothing? And how do we find peace with that? I feel like that is inextricably connected to our ability to experience ourselves as animists. It is this state of being aware that everything is sentient and alive and beings all interacting. And ether is this reminder that at the smallest levels of ourselves, even when we're completely unaware, that interconnectedness is still happening. The season that we're working with in this runecast is spring. It's a green light. It's for sure a green light to plant what you feel is going to be stabilizing and sustaining for you when it comes to transitioning away from this place of getting what you need from the sun, being able to hold that and transmute it into what you're able to give others, especially with regard to where there is deep change, like sacrificial level change with Tiwaz, and the understanding that we need support as we move into grieving whatever it is that we're letting go of, whatever we're sacrificing. Spring is this point where we can more safely venture beyond our usual thresholds, our Utengard. We can return to the forest. The space that spring holds is the opportunity to diverge outward and explore new territory. So expanding horizons and exploring new growth, generating new growth, behaving in a way that we're aware that the world around us is re-emerging, it's changing, and to move carefully. So even though we're allowed to move further out of our usual habitat, do it carefully and thoughtfully, because things in the world are awakening that are new and need special care. And I think in terms of Tiwaz, spring is particularly about the resources that are growing, the resources that may not entirely be available yet. It may be that there's tension felt around that. Okay, I've had this sacrificial space, or I'm living in a world that is made up of sacrificial space right now, and I need resources, but maybe they're just not here yet. It isn't that they're not coming. It isn't that they aren't growing. The seeds are planted. They are there. They will greet us in their time and in the timing that we most need them. I can kind of sort of see some hope attached to this experience of spring in the runecast. The earthly helping spirit walking with us this week is Shell. And this particular one is one that my daughter gave me that she picked up from a beach in Polzeth in Cornwall. Shell is this reminder that we have the ability to thrive in any form, and that no matter how we have to shape ourselves, we are still us. Shells connect us to the ocean, obviously, home, again, pointing back to the east, but also to what the ocean represents, this incredible raw power that I don't think we even are aware. I think this points back to Thordisaz territory, this raw unconscious capacity to just get shit done, to just knock things out and get it done, make it happen. And it also reminds us that we have depth, like fathomless depth, which I think, again, points back to ether. And we also have eternal tranquility. We have the capacity for tranquility. And I know that most of us don't think of ourselves in that capacity. But let the ocean remind us, yes, it can be stormy, it can be rocky, it can be all kinds of things as it experiences the elements. And it can also be this absolute sea of tranquility. And I think that Shell is a reminder to find that in ourselves. Like we're constantly reminded that we can thrive in uncertainty, that we can thrive in all kinds of challenge. But do you know that you can survive in tranquility? Do you know that about yourself? Have you ever experienced tranquility long enough to sit with the idea that you can thrive in tranquility? Take some time to sit with Shell this week and see what it has to say to you. The transition from the second to the third Aett is particularly important in this runic cycle, I think. I call the third Aett the Aett of reckoning. And what I mean by that is by the time you get to the end of the second Aett, you know the deal. You know what it means to be a soul informed, specifically as a human by this point. You understand what's at stake. Nothing new is going to happen at this point. So when we transition into the third Aett, all of the runes of the third Aett are reminding us of our fortitude. They're reminding us of the foundation that we've created in relationships, within ourselves, with the world around us, with the world beyond us. And with those in mind, can we do it again? Can we see this runic cycle through to the end and choose to do it over? Because that's what happens. We come back the beginning of the Futhark. We start with Fehu. We start a new year, a new cycle. We do it all over again. Can you do it? That is the reckoning. It is internal. And I feel like asking ourselves that question as we move through the third Aett in this runic cycle is going to be imperative. It's going to be really clarifying about what we bring and what we have to do in our time here. The Galder that we're working with this week is Sowilo, Solhi, Sig, along with Jera, Yara, Yero, Yard, Yarda, Yardal. And then in the latter part of the week, we have Tiwaz, Tiwa, Tiwa, Tiered, and Jera. I'm not done with Sowilo, so that's where I still am pretty firmly in this Galder. When you work with the transitions, keep the half-month rune with its modifier rune and then move to the next half-month rune with that modifier rune, because if you do all three at once, that's not this runecast, that's something else. So honor that transition and keep the pairings together. This is how it came together for me. Sol, yard, 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 sol, yard. Sol, hiera, sol, hiera, sol, hiera, sol, hiera, sol, hiera. The last several Galders have really challenged my relationship to cadence, and I think I commented on this last time. It's really demanded that I shake up my synapses, and that fits everything that I'm being told about, like personally and collectively, about what is happening on the planet and what has to happen collectively for the planet as a whole to move through the transition that's happening right now, seen and unseen, is you can take nothing with you. You have to be willing to put down everything. This is a Tiwaz moment on the planet right now. This is a sacrificial heart song moment. You have to be willing to put everything down. And that fundamentally starts with each of us individually. And it starts synaptically. It starts at the way we think and the way we look at the world, the way we logic things together. That has to change. We have to be willing to unravel that to see the new ways that move us beyond what we're experiencing on the planet now. We create new realities from new synapses, not old ones. And that is what I feel like shuffling up the cadence is doing for me with Galder of late. I do not like it. It grates on my nerves. That's literally a synaptic change. I don't like it. It feels uncomfortable. It feels abrupt. It's not the way I want it to be. It's not the ruts that I'm used to. And that is the whole point. I would love to hear how you're doing, what you're doing as you move through this time. How are you moving through this transition from the second to the third Aett? How are you moving from sunlight to sacrifice? Thank you for all that you do.